April 3, 1996. FBI agents surround a primitive cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, where Theodore Kaczynski sits building another bomb. For 17 years, the brilliant mathematician has evaded the FBI's longest and most expensive manhunt in history. Inside his 10 by 12-foot shack with no electricity or running water, agents will discover bomb components, 40,000 pages of journals documenting his crimes, and one live bomb ready for mailing. 34 years before that cabin arrest, Theodore Kaczynski graduated high school at age 15 and entered Harvard University on a scholarship at age 16. The brilliant child from Chicago had been ahead of his classmates academically throughout high school, mastering advanced mathematics so quickly he was placed in accelerated classes. His intellect was undeniable. One of his school's 5 national merit finalists, with what would later be measured as an IQ of 167. But Harvard wasn't the triumph his family expected. A high school classmate later observed that Kaczynski was emotionally unprepared. They packed him up and sent him to Harvard before he was ready. He didn't even have a driver's license. The mathematical prodigy who had dominated small-town academics suddenly found himself among America's elite, living in 8 Prescott Street, housing designed for the youngest, most precocious incoming students. The isolation began immediately. Other undergraduates described him as shy, quiet, and a loner who never talked to anyone. He would just rush through the suite, go into his room, and slam the door. When we would go into his room, there would be piles of books and uneaten sandwiches that would make the place smell. Despite his reputation for brilliance, Theodore Kaczynski's withdrawn and alienated demeanor had caught the eye of Dr. Henry Murray, one of Harvard's most renowned psychology professors. Murray was director of the Harvard Psychological Clinic in the School of Arts and Sciences and had a research center named after him on campus. But Murray's academic credentials masked a darker history. In 1943, Murray was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime intelligence agency that would later become the CIA. During World War II, Murray helped design Station S, an elite assessment facility where would-be spies underwent psychological stress tests involving deception, sensory overload, and emotional manipulation. These methods aimed to identify who could survive clandestine operations and who would crack. Now, back at Harvard, Murray was launching his most ambitious experiment yet, a series of 3-year experiments titled Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men. Murray was specifically seeking vulnerable students who would make ideal test subjects. Kaczynski, already socially isolated and accelerated into Harvard at 16, was particularly vulnerable. From late 1959 to early 1962, Murray subjected 22 Harvard undergraduates to unethical experiments designed to measure their responses to extreme stress. The process was engineered to break students down psychologically through aggressive verbal attacks, characterized as vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive. The experiment didn't just stress Kaczynski, it targeted his very sense of coherence, eroding the fragile bridge between intellect and identity. His code name in the experiment was Lawful, though the experiment was anything but lawful. What made these experiments particularly sinister was their timing and funding. Murray's work unfolded in the early Cold War, when the CIA was actively exploring psychological manipulation as a tool for intelligence operations. The agency's interest in breaking down human resistance would later become public through the MKUltra scandal. But in the late 1950s, Murray's experiments at Harvard represented the cutting edge of this classified research. After learning about Murray's CIA-funded psychological experiments targeting vulnerable Harvard students like Kaczynski, Do you think these unethical stress tests played a role in shaping the future Unabomber? Comment your answer below. Now let's see how these psychological scars would manifest when Kaczynski left Harvard and retreated to his Montana wilderness. 3 years after his psychological torment at Harvard, Theodore Kaczynski found himself teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, the youngest assistant professor of mathematics in the school's history. But success in academia couldn't heal the damage Murray's experiments had inflicted. Kaczynski struggled at Berkeley, stammering and mumbling through his own lectures, unable to connect with the students who looked to him for guidance. In 1969, without explanation or warning, Kaczynski abruptly resigned from his prestigious position. The academic world that had once promised him everything, recognition, respect, intellectual fulfillment, had become unbearable. He was fleeing not just his career, but civilization itself. In 1971, Kaczynski and his brother David purchased a plot of land near Lincoln, Montana, deep in the wilderness, where no roads reached and no neighbors disturbed the silence. Here, Ted would build his refuge from the modern world that had wounded him so deeply. He constructed a 10 by 12-foot cabin with his own hands, a structure that would serve as his home for the next 24 years. The cabin was primitive by design. No heat, electricity, or running water. Kaczynski heated it with a single wood stove, slept on a simple cot, and filled every available space with books from the local library. He lived in near-total isolation, hunting rabbits, growing vegetables, and spending much of his time reading. This wasn't poverty. It was philosophy made manifest. While living this remote survivalist lifestyle, Kaczynski developed an increasingly rigid anti-government and anti-technology worldview. But isolation breeds obsession. Over time, Kaczynski grew to realize that his chosen way of life was being threatened by modern urbanization. Every encroachment of technology, logging roads cutting deeper into the wilderness, developers eyeing his remote corner of Montana, became evidence of a larger conspiracy. By the early 1970s, Kaczynski began constructing his first bombs in the cabin's cramped interior, crude devices designed to target the symbols of technological progress he had come to despise. By 1978, 7 years into his Montana exile, Theodore Kaczynski had transformed from a reclusive mathematician into something far more dangerous. The man that the world would eventually know as Theodore Kaczynski came to our attention in 1978 with the explosion of his first primitive homemade bomb at a Chicago university, when a security guard opened the package and suffered a hand injury when the bomb inside exploded. The psychological wounds from Dr. Murray's experiments had festered in isolation, evolving into a calculated campaign of terror. Over the next 17 years, he mailed or hand-delivered a series of increasingly sophisticated bombs that killed 3 Americans and injured nearly 24 more. From his primitive cabin, Kaczynski methodically selected targets he believed represented technological progress: university professors, airline executives, computer store owners. But behind each target was a human being with a family, dreams, and a future that would be shattered by Kaczynski's calculated violence. Picture the moment when someone opens what appears to be an ordinary package. Maybe it's a professor at their desk, surrounded by student papers to grade, expecting a book or academic materials. The package feels heavier than expected, and there's something unsettling about its crude construction. In that split second before the explosion, there's often just enough time for confusion, a furrowed brow, a hesitation. Then the device detonates, filling the room with smoke, shrapnel, and screaming. The victim's hands, the very tools they use to teach or create, become mangled beyond recognition. Family members rush to hospitals, not knowing if their loved one will survive, wondering how their ordinary day became a nightmare. Each bombing demonstrated Kaczynski's growing expertise and escalating violence. In November 1979, American Airlines Flight 444, flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C., fills with smoke after a bomb detonates in the luggage compartment, forcing an emergency landing and injuring 12 passengers. Imagine the terror of passengers who smell smoke at 30,000 feet. The sudden drop in altitude, oxygen masks falling, children crying. The bomb was easily strong enough to bring down the aircraft had the timer functioned properly, meaning hundreds of innocent travelers came within minutes of death because of Kaczynski's twisted ideology. The human cost extended beyond the immediate victims. Families lived in constant fear. A professor's spouse might hesitate before bringing in the mail, knowing their partner's work made them a potential target. Children learned to be suspicious of unexpected packages. University campuses, once sanctuaries of learning, became places where opening mail required courage. The FBI's response was unprecedented. In 1979, an FBI-led task force that included the ATF and U.S. Postal Inspection Service was formed to investigate the Unabomber case, codenamed for the university and airline bombing targets involved. The task force would grow to more than 150 full-time investigators, analysts, and others. By this point, the Unabomber had been the target of the most expensive investigation in FBI history at the time. A 2000 report by the United States Commission on the Advancement of Federal Law Enforcement stated that the task force had spent over $50 million on the investigation. But Kaczynski remained several steps ahead of them. These efforts proved of little use in identifying, but 17 years of meticulous planning couldn't protect Theodore Kaczynski from one fatal miscalculation: his own words. In 1995, Kaczynski mailed several letters to media outlets outlining his goals and demanding a major newspaper print his 35,000-word essay, Industrial Society and Its Future, dubbed the Unabomber Manifesto by the FBI, verbatim. He stated he would desist from terrorism if this demand was met. The brilliant mathematician who had evaded capture through isolation and methodical anonymity was about to expose himself through the very intellect that had made him so dangerous. There was controversy as to whether the essay should be published, but Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh recommended its publication out of concern for public safety and in the hope that a reader could identify the author. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post published the manifesto in its entirety in September 1995. The FBI's gamble paid off in ways they could never have anticipated. Before the publication of Industrial Society and Its Future, Kaczynski's brother, David, was encouraged by his wife to follow up on suspicions that Ted was the Unabomber. David was dismissive at first, but he took the likelihood more seriously after reading the manifesto a week after it was published in September 1995. He searched through old family papers and found letters dating to the 1970s that Ted had sent to newspapers to protest the abuses of technology, using phrasing similar to that found in the manifesto. The recognition was devastating. David Kaczynski found himself staring at his brother's unmistakable writing style, his philosophical arguments, his particular way of constructing sentences about technology's dangers. The manifesto wasn't just similar to Ted's old letters. It was written by the same mind, the same wounded intellect that had been shaped by Murray's psychological experiments decades earlier. Imagine the horror of recognizing your own brother's voice in the words of America's most wanted terrorist. The realization that the person you grew up with, shared childhood memories with, had become a killer. In February 1996, after months of agonizing deliberation, David contacted the FBI. The decision tore him apart. He was turning in his own brother, the brilliant mathematician who had once been the family's pride. But David also understood that Ted's psychological transformation had made him a killer, and more people would die if he remained free. The weight of that choice, protecting innocent strangers by destroying his own family, represents a different kind of victimization that Kaczynski's campaign created. The FBI moved quickly on David's information. They obtained handwriting samples, compared linguistic patterns, and built their case. On April 3, 1996, federal agents surrounded that primitive Montana cabin where our story began. When they arrested Theodore Kaczynski, they found not just bomb-making materials, but the complete psychological journey from Harvard prodigy to domestic terrorist. 40,000 pages of journals documenting his descent from Dr. Murray's vulnerable test subject to the Unabomber. In the end, the very intellect that had made Kaczynski so dangerous, his need to articulate his philosophy, to justify his actions through written argument, became his downfall. The Harvard student who had been psychologically broken by unethical experiments was finally captured because he couldn't resist sharing the worldview that those experiments had helped create. His transformation from brilliant mathematician to domestic terrorist was complete, but so was his capture. The Unabomber case stands as a chilling reminder of how psychological wounds, left to fester in isolation, can transform genius into something monstrous. Theodore Kaczynski's journey from Harvard's youngest students to America's most wanted domestic terrorist reveals the devastating power of unethical psychological manipulation, and how even the most brilliant minds can be broken and reshaped by trauma. Perhaps most unsettling is what Kaczynski's story tells us about the institutions we trust to shape young minds. When universities become laboratories for psychological experimentation, when brilliant students become unwitting test subjects, we risk creating the very monsters we fear. The tragedy isn't just that Kaczynski became a terrorist, it's that his victims might have been prevented.
If the adults responsible for his education had chosen nurturing over exploitation. In our rush to understand the human mind, we must never forget that behind every psychological experiment sits a real person, whose future hangs in the balance. Some wounds, once inflicted, can never truly heal. Subscribe for more criminal masterminds brought down by their own hubris, and watch this one next.